All right, welcome to week 9, helping in social psychology. So many social psych textbooks begin discussions about helping behavior with the story of Kitty Genovese. The story sort of goes that she was stabbed to death by her ex-boyfriend, I believe, in front of 30 or so witnesses. Um, the details of the story change, depending on which textbook you're looking at. But the conclusion of the story is that she was murdered in plain view of many witnesses who did not stop and help her. If you'd like sort of a video rendition of that story, you can click on this link here in the PowerPoint and just watch the first three minutes. It'll sort of go over the details of the story. Now, as it turns out, this story is not exactly true in the way that it's told in social psychology textbooks. It wasn't that 38 people witnessed her. In fact, many of the witnesses were not eyewitnesses. They actually just heard a scream from somewhere. She was ultimately killed in a stairwell, not in a courtyard of a sort of New York City, or you can think of Chicago kind of style building. And in that stairwell, there was only one real eyewitness who witnessed, and people did in fact call the police. But it is kind of a compelling story because it highlights this issue about when do people help and when do people not help someone who's in need. You can think of another example. So if you recall, there was a baby who fell into a well, baby Jessica, and this is back in the 1980s. And her story was publicized by the news media, and she received tremendous amounts of help. Over $1 million of donations that people sent in for this little baby who fell into this well. And then you have issues like or examples like the 9/11 first responders. These are people who, sacrificed, potentially their lives, some of them, their long-term health, put themselves in really dangerous situations to save other people. And this is pretty tremendous. The Carnegie Hero Foundation gives out monetary awards to people who offer this kind of above and beyond tremendous help. So the question that we're sort of grappling with this week is why do people help? When do they help? When do they not help? Right? Sometimes people don't help at all. Sometimes they help even though it doesn't matter. Sometimes they help when it's a risk to their own life. And, the question that we're sort of grappling with is, what is it about the people in the situation that lead them to help or to not help? So when we talk about helping, just brief definition, we can talk about this as pro-social behavior. This is any behavior that benefits other people. Importantly, it doesn't matter what your motivation is when we're talking about pro-social behavior. So if you are helping someone, think of the norm of reciprocity, which we talked about. If you're helping someone because you expect that they're going to return the favor, that behavior is still pro-social behavior. If your friend calls you and says, I'm in a bind and my sitter canceled and I need someone to watch my kid, and you say, okay, I'll watch your kid, and you know full well that you're going to ask them to watch your kid later on, that's still pro-social behavior. You're still helping that person. Okay, we can contrast this to altruism, and there's a sort of a philosophical debate about altruism. Altruism is helping behavior, pro-social behavior, where there is no direct benefit to you. So, one can behave altruistically only when they cannot receive any benefit whatsoever. And you could psychologists who are into this kind of thing will argue about whether or not altruism really exists. But just be aware of the distinction. Helping can be very minimal, volunteering, donating, simply, giving a couple quarters to the Salvation Army people around Christmas time. Or it can be, helping a friend with a homework or dragging someone out of a burning building. It sort of runs the gambit. All right, so on altruism, that I sort of mentioned before, is this sort of, pro-social behavior that is voluntary and you are not getting any kind of reward, right? Versus egoistic helping, which is when you're helping someone but you're motivated by selfish concerns. Um, so you, you're trying to think of a good example. Your son or daughter is doing their homework, and you spend some time helping them because you have to be, somewhere in an hour and they need to finish, and that's sort of a somewhat selfish concern. Whereas you might just sort of let them continue to struggle and figure it out on their own, and then be late to the event. Um, so the argument about altruism is that is it possible to behave pro-socially without receiving any kind of reward, right? Because the people who argue against this position will say that even feeling good about what you did is a kind of reward, and that makes whatever behavior you did not altruistic. Right? So if I help you, if I donate my time to, at the homeless soup kitchen on the weekends, and I feel good about what I've done, then that's not altruistic because I've received some kind of benefit from that. Again, this is sort of a big debate. You can argue this, but just be aware of that. So one question we might ask is, when are we going to help other people? The big question in social psychology at the time of the Kitty Genovese case was, how is it possible that these people could observe, and again, you could debate the details of the story, but how is it possible that people could observe someone get murdered and do nothing at all? Right? Is it something about New Yorkers, because this happened in New York, or is it something about the situation? And this led to a pretty rich line of research into what we call the bystander effect, which is that people are generally less likely to offer help to someone when they are in the presence of other people compared to when they are alone. And this is going to be a big theme for this week. Right. So the research has sort of outlined a variety of steps that one needs to go through in order to make the decision to help someone. First, you have to sort of notice that there is an emergency. You have to notice that someone needs help. You have to interpret this as an emergency. Someone, so you have to see it, then you have to decide, yeah, this is a person who needs help. You have to assume responsibility for helping, right? So you have to look around and say, I'm the one who's in charge of helping this person. And then you have to choose some kind of strategy to help, and you have to actually be able to implement the strategy. And we're going to go through, we're going to talk about some of the research on each of these 5 stages. So noticing is one of the biggest issues in terms of helping behavior. You have to notice that there's a problem. You have to notice that someone needs help. Most of the time, we sort of talked about this, people are distracted, right? People are running on their automated processes. They're not actively thinking about the situation that they're in. And if you're distracted and you're not actively thinking, you might not even notice that there's a problem. For example, a friend of mine was at a McDonald's in North Dakota, and there was a man slumped over the table in this McDonald's. And it turns out that the man was dead, that he had suffered a heart attack or some kind of problem, and he died right there in this McDonald's. No one noticed that he was slumped over. No one noticed this person, and no one helped this person. Now, you could argue whether or not he could have gotten help and how long he had been slumped over there. But again, the idea is that you're distracted by your own food, you're distracted by the other people around. You see someone slumped over, you might not even notice that they might need help. Milgram, another idea from Milgram is this idea of stimulus overload, that if we are in big cities, we are less likely to help because of stimulus overload. And this is the idea that the more that is going on, the more busy our environment is, the more that takes up our cognitive resources, right? If you are walking down Wabash Avenue during rush hour, downtown Chicago, there's going to be a lot more activity going on around you compared to, walking around downtown Joliet at rush hour. And that activity takes up cognitive resources. It's distracting, and it makes it less likely for you to notice someone who might be having a problem. Another key issue to noticing is time constraints. If you are in a hurry, then this is going to reduce helping behavior. And you can think of being in a hurry as, taking up cognitive resources, right? If you're ever late for an important appointment, you know that you're spending a lot of your time as you are trying to get to this appointment thinking about the fact that you are late. There's a classic study in psychology, social psychology, the Good Samaritan study. It's based on the Good Samaritan parable in the Bible. They did this study at Princeton with theology students. So these are, students who are in school for, to learn to be priests. And the Good Samaritan study, if you're familiar, or the Good Samaritan parable in the Bible, if you're familiar, has to do with, a person who's been robbed and left for dead on the side of the road. And in the Bible, Jesus tells the story about, priests and rich people who pass this person and leave them. And then, the Samaritan, who is sort of the relatively low status group in that society, stops to help this person. And, the parable goes on to, to suggest that, that it's important for us to sort of stop and help. And so these Princeton theology students, they were given a task to actually give a talk on this Good Samaritan study. Or they were given a task to talk about the career, because the researchers thought, well, maybe if we highlight this, this might have an effect. And then they were randomly assigned to one of three conditions. So again, we have two independent variables here. Seminary career versus, so the talk, the content of the talk, and then they were randomly assigned to a time constraint. They were either behind schedule, so running very late. They were on time, or they were ahead of schedule. They were going to be early. And then what they did is they had these students go from one building to another. And there's only one route that they could take, and along that route, they had a Confederate person working for the researcher who was moaning sort of on the ground in an alley as they passed by. And the question, the key dependent variable was, did they stop and help, and how long did they stop and help? What kind of help did they offer? And when we look at the results, we see that when they were in a really big hurry, when they were in no hurry at all, the students, the people in the Good Samaritan topic, were actually significantly more likely to help than the people in the career topic, right? Because they had this on their mind, helping, this Good Samaritan study, and they stopped and helped. What's interesting is that the level of helping decreased when we added time constraints, where only 10% of both groups, people who were thinking about Good Samaritan versus career, only 10% of them helped. Right? And so what this suggests is that if you are limited in your time, that will decrease the likelihood that you will help, or if people around you are limited in the time and you need help, that will decrease the likelihood that they will help. The next phase is interpreting emergency situations. So you have to interpret this emergency situation as an emergency. Oftentimes, emergency situations are ambiguous. You can think about, the example of the man who is slumped over the chair at McDonald's. Maybe he's having a heart attack, or maybe he's just sleeping. Right? Maybe he's looking down at his phone that's in his lap. Right? This is an ambiguous situation. Right? When I do my face-to-face classes, I talk about, when I was an undergraduate taking social psychology, I had a professor who would actually have a student scream outside of his classroom to see what people would do. So I asked the question, like, if you heard a scream outside of this classroom, what would you do right now? Most students in this social psych class, or at least in my class when this happened, so there's a scream out in the hallway, and the professor keeps talking, and what does everyone else in the room do? We just sit right there and do nothing. Right. In fact, as I recall, when I was an undergrad, there was the scream and then the sound of like heavy items dropping. Like I believe it was a graduate student who was in the hall and she dropped a bunch of books. Right. But so, if you hear a scream, it's like it's an ambiguous cue, right? You don't know. Maybe someone's just messing around, right? You hear this all the time with kids. When they play, they scream, and it's kind of hard to tell. Like, are they fighting, and is this a problem, or are they just being kids and having a good time? Right? So one way that we can sort of, disambiguate situations is by making our plight clear. One thing that they will, teach, one thing that they will teach screaming kids, one thing that they will teach kids is that, if someone is, trying to take a kid, right, if someone is taking a kid or someone is doing something to a kid, they teach them to scream like, you are not my dad, you are not my mom, right? Because if you see someone with a screaming child, you're going to assume that's their kid and that kid, is being punished or is having a fit. But if you see a screaming child who's screaming, you are not my dad, then you are going to clearly know that this is a problem. This is the same thing for, they will teach this to women in sort of self-defense classes, right? To scream, I don't know you, if someone is attacking them. Because again, people will be more likely to interpret that as an emergency as opposed to someone having a domestic, disturbance or some kind of, a fight with a significant other, right? So, if you are ever in a situation where, you are potentially going to be a victim of some kind of crime, you have to make it clear to the other people around you that this is an emergency. Screaming, calling for help, looking at people specifically and saying, you help me, and making it clear that this person is a perpetrator of a crime. Again, if you make direct eye contact, make direct requests, then you can individuate people, right? We talked about this idea and we talked about group processes of de-individuation. By making eye contact with people and making direct requests, you help me, you're singling them out and making them individuated. Oh yeah, that's my Star Wars nerd joke. Oftentimes, though, we look to other people to determine how we should respond in a particular situation. So there's a classic Latane and Darley study that was inspired by the Kitty Genovese case. And what they did was they had participants come into a room and fill out a survey questionnaire. And then while they're filling out the survey questionnaire, out from underneath a door or a vent, there's many different versions of the study, smoke just starts pouring into the room. And what they did was they varied the number of people that were in the room with the participant. So either the participant was in the room by themselves, or they were in the room with two other Confederates. And the Confederates were instructed to do nothing, to look at the smoke and then go back to continuing to work on the survey questionnaire. And what they found is that when people are alone, they got up right away, went out to the office and said, hey, there's something wrong, there's smoke coming out of this vent. But when they were with those two other people who didn't react to the smoke, they themselves also were less likely to react. So again, if you want to see a video of what this looks like, you can go ahead and click on this link here. And it's just this first sort of minute from 3:07 to 4:52. And if you want to leave that link open in your browser, I'm going to return to that video in a minute for a different study. So take a look at that. Right, so if you've watched the video, right, you see when you see the person sees the smoke and they're by themselves, right, they don't interpret it, they interpret it as more dangerous than when they are with other people, right, or at least they didn't interpret the situation as the emergency, right. When they're with these two, so when they're by themselves, most people go for help within 4 minutes of smoke coming into the room. When they're with two other subjects, right, so now, these are not Confederates, they're actually all just participants, right, with no instructions, helping reaction decrease to 38%. And when you're with those Confederates who don't react, it goes down even further, right? And so what's interesting about this is that this is evidence that when we are in these emergency situations, we don't have sort of a way to respond that's automatic. So what do? We look to other people and use other people as sources of information for how we ought to behave, right? And so, you know, the end of the sort of conclusion here is that, you know, when we are out in the world acting, you know, if we're confronted with an ambiguous situation or we're confronted with an emergency situation, it's kind of unclear. And we look around and we don't see other people reacting, right? Then we engage in what's called pluralistic ignorance. This idea that if we look around and we see other people not reacting, then we must be interpreting the situation wrong, right? Because if it were really an emergency, then someone else would have interpreted it as an emergency. Right? But the problem is that when everyone looks around and everyone comes to that same conclusion, then nobody is going to react, right? If nobody reacts, then we aren't going to either. Interesting though, if at least one person reacts, then we will probably react too. So here's a link to a story about a man who had a seizure and fell onto the subway tracks in New York. And as a train is coming, someone jumps down there and carries this guy off of the tracks back onto the platform. Right, that's a pretty heroic act. And other people helped this individual as he's trying to pull this person up. Right? But if no one had reacted, if no one had jumped down there, right, in all likelihood, that person would have died. So even if you've noticed and you've interpreted an emergency situation as one in which you need to help, you actually have to assume that it's your responsibility to help, right? So, for example, if you are, driving down the highway and there's a car on fire on the side of the road, most of the time you are going to assume that someone else called 911. Right? You're going to assume, well, someone probably called that. They're probably fine. Someone else is helping, right? And we call this the diffusion of responsibility, right? When we're in a group of people, we assume that someone else is helping. And the problem here is that, again, if everyone assumes that, then no one is helping. So one sort of general rule or take home is that you must always assume that you are responsible. Always call 911 if you see something. You never know if someone has or hasn't. Worst case scenario, 911 will just say, yeah, we know, someone's on the way, and then at least you know. Here's another video example you can take a look at. This is a different video. This shows this bystander effect, this diffusion of responsibility, pretty succinctly. They take a person and have them sort of lay down on the steps and moan, similar to the Good Samaritan study at a busy train station in London. And you can literally see people will step over this person who's in need of help. So again, that's an interesting video to take a look at. There's some more evidence about assuming responsibility that comes out of Darley and Latané, and this is the seizure study. And again, this video that we've been watching so far, if the one that just showed the smoke-filled room, if you watch from 4:55 to the end, you can see an example of this seizure study. Participants are brought into these rooms, and they're told that they're engaging in a discussion about what college life is like. And for the purposes of the experiment, all of the participants are in other rooms, and you're talking to them over an intercom. So each participant is in their own little closet with their own little intercom, and they're talking to these other participants. And while this is going on, they hear a tape recording of a participant having a seizure over the intercom. So again, if you watch the video, you'll hear what this sounds like. And what's interesting about this is that the seizure is unambiguous. So clearly all the participants understood that this person needs help, right? The person literally says, I'm having a seizure, I need help, okay? And what they did was they varied the number of people that the participants think that they are with, right? So again, imagine yourself as a participant, you come in, you're sitting down in a room, you have a headset on, and you're having a discussion with other people about what college life is like. And if it is just you and one other person, right, that person who's having a seizure, versus you and two other people, versus you and five other people, right? What we find is that when you are with five other people, right, let's add all this. When you are with five other people, so it's you, the person who's having the seizure, and then there's three other people, right? What this means is that, or what happens is, only 31% of people responded right away. And about 60% of them eventually responded. At some point, got up, left the room, and went and found the researcher and said, hey, there's a problem, we need help. Okay. Interestingly, the amount of helping that you get goes up as you decrease the amount of people, right? So when it is one other person, right, when you are the only person in the room, right, it's you and this person who's having a seizure, there is no diffusion of responsibility. You are the only one who's responsible, right? And when that happens, 85% of people went for help within 2 minutes, and 100% of people eventually got up and went for help. Right. So again, the idea here is that other people, the presence of other people, allow for this diffusion of responsibility, right? If you know that there's a bunch of other people, then you can think to yourself, well, it's not my job. I don't need to do anything. Someone else is doing something. Now, once you've taken responsibility for helping, you have to think about how to help, right? And there's plenty of things that can interfere with this, right? So competence, right? If you don't know how to help, then you're not going to. The presence of others can make this worse. Like if you feel like you're going to be embarrassed, or you feel like you're going to do it wrong, then you're going to be less likely to help, right? So you can think of, the person who falls under the subway tracks. If you think that you just don't have the physical strength to lift that person up off the tracks, then you're probably not going to, jump down there and try and help. Likewise, if you are, with a group of friends, and there's someone who's sort of moaning on the pavement as you walk by, and none of your friends seem to want to move to help, you might be embarrassed by having to say, no, guys, let's stop and help. And so that might prevent you from helping. And this is this idea of audience inhibition. If we think that we're going to look foolish, or we think we're doing something wrong, then we may be pressured to not help in that situation. We also typically are going to do a cost-benefit analysis. So people, when we look at these kinds of situations, we will often think about what is the cost to us, especially if the cost is high, right? So, if the cost of not helping the victim is very high, and the cost to helping the cost to the helper, right? So the risk that I'm taking to help this person jumping down on the subway tracks is really high. Then it depends on whether or not I'm going to help, right? I will look around and see, are there other people? If there's, not a lot of cost to the victim, right? The victim's probably going to be all right, and there's low cost to me, right? I'm not running late. I'm not having to spend money. I'm not having to do these things. Then probably are going to help. But if there's a high cost to the victim and a low cost to me, then you're definitely going to help. If there's a stroller in the middle of the road with a crying baby, right? And there's, you will definitely go out into the road and get that baby, right? It doesn't cost you much to do it, and there's a huge cost to the victim. Versus, if you think sort of the opposite end of that spectrum. So if, the person, is low cost, there's low cost to not helping them. So you can think about sort of the homeless person who's, asking for money on the, 95th Street Bridge when you get off the highway there. They've got clothes, they look like they're doing all right. And, you're busy, you don't have time, right? That's high cost to you, then you're going to be less likely to help in that situation. Right. And when you get to this, it depends when it's high cost to the victim, but also high cost to the helper. Your personality will come into play, right? Who you are, and we'll talk about that. So we help when we notice that it's an emergency, we interpret it as an emergency, we hold ourselves responsible, and we decide that we can actually do something about it and the risks aren't too high. Okay, so we're going to take a pause here. Go ahead and open up Activity 9. And what I want you to do is go through and just circle the answers to the questions. And do this before you watch the rest of this video. Go through and circle the answers to the questions. And the question is, in this scenario, you have to help one of these two people. And you have to pick who you're going to help. And whoever you don't pick is going to die, right? So this is kind of a messed up scenario. But what I want you to do is go through, and I promise there's a good reason for doing this, and just pick who do you save. You can only save one, and you've got to pick one, and the other person is surely going to die. So you must pick, go through and circle for each of them, pause the video. Once you've gotten those all circled, come back and watch the rest of this. All right, so I'm going to assume that you've gone through and filled out Activity 9. We can also think about helping from this evolutionary perspective. Again, remember, for evolutionary psychology and evolutionary theory, the key component here is our ability to successfully transmit our genes to the next generation. And one thing that we're sort of interested in from this evolutionary perspective is this idea of kin selection and reciprocal altruism. Kin selection means that we are going to be more likely to help people who share our genetic makeup. And in fact, there's going to be a positive relationship. The more that they share our genetic makeup, our genetic endowment, the more likely we are going to be to help them. Reciprocal altruism, excuse me, states that we're going to be more likely to help people who are going to be in a position to help us later on, right? We're more likely to help people who we think are probably going to help us in the future. So this kin selection idea is, it's all about promoting genetic success. This happens actually even for plants. So there's a link here. This is kind of a mind-blowing thing. Plants, if you take two plants of different species or of different genetic backgrounds, so you take two rose bushes that are genetically different, and you put them in the same pot, their roots will compete for the nutrients in that soil. So they will try to get to the nutrients and suck them up as fast as possible to keep the other plant from getting them. Interestingly, though, if you take two plants that are genetically similar, that they come from the same genetic background, they don't do this root competition, which is fascinating. Um, but the idea here is that the more genes someone shares with you, the more likely you are to help them. And the more likely they are to pass on your genes, the more likely they are to help them. So we'll go through this this activity. So, when you think of genetics, so parents and kids, 50%, siblings, 50%. The further away that they get from you, in terms of family, the less genetics that you guys share. And generally speaking, yeah, so, strangers, they don't share much of our genes at all. So we go back to this exercise. So I always say, raise your hand if you save the spouse or the child. And usually what we find is that people save the child. Now, why do people save the child? So most of you probably pick save the child. People save the child because the child shares more genes with you than your spouse, right? Again, from the evolutionary perspective. There's other reasons, too, we could talk about. If you save the 5-year-old or the 1-year-old, everyone says the 5-year-old, right? Evolutionary explanation says that, by the time a kid reaches 5, there's a really good chance that they're going to make it into adulthood and that they're going to be able to have their own kids. 1-year-olds, on the other hand, they're still in that tenuous, vulnerable phase, right? There's a lot of things that can go wrong with babies between 1 and 5. And so this means you're going to be more likely to choose the 5-year-old. So you're going to save Bill or you're going to save Bob, right? You're going to save Bob, right? The reason why you're going to save Bob is because Bob is younger. He still has time to pass on his genes. Bill is older. He may not, he's already lived sort of a full life. Mary or Millie, same thing, right? You're going to save Millie because she's closer to childbearing years. Mary is just, unlikely to pass on your genes. Who will mourn more, the father or the mother? The evolutionary psychologist says that it's the mother, right? And part of evolutionary psychology, first is that, the mother knows that it's her child, right? If, fathers, paternity, it's sometimes questionable, again, from an evolutionary perspective. But mothers always know that child is their child. The other idea is that, women can have less children than men. Right? We mentioned this already once before, right? Men can have as many babies as they can find willing partners. Women, on the other hand, are limited in the number of children that they can have over a lifetime. Who's going to be more grief, right? We're going to be sadder about the healthy child, right? Because again, the healthy child's more likely to pass on genes. We're going to be sadder about a son. Again, this idea of males can have more children than females, right? The older parents are going to be sadder because they have less likelihood of having another child. All of these sorts of things. So, oftentimes we are going to help other people when it benefits our genes. In fact, that Carnegie Heroes from the beginning, right, where they give monetary awards for extreme acts of heroism, they exclude people who are saving or helping members of their immediate family, right? Because they recognize that we are sort of motivated inherently to help those who share our genetic background, right? It's not extraordinary for you to run into a burning building to save your child. Anyone would do that, right? Reciprocal altruism reciprocal altruism is this idea that we help other people who are likely to be able to help us in the future. And we include this in the evolutionary perspective because this gives a good explanation for why we help people who are not genetically related to us. Right? We help people who are genetically related so that they can pass on our genes that we all share, but we help people who are not genetically related because we know that they might help us in the future. So you can think of, there's examples of this in the in the animal world. So vampire bats will only help those who recently helped them. Chimpanzees will share their food with one another on the assumption that, well, I found this big pile of food here and I will share it with you. So when you find a big pile of food, you will share it with me. Now, there's evolutionary aspects to this. There's also personality aspects to this. So some people are more likely to help than others. And this is closely related to this construct of empathy. In fact, there's a hypothesis called the empathy altruism hypothesis that suggests that the more empathetic concern a person feels, the more selfless they are in helping. And this includes two pieces, so perspective taking and concern. Empathetic concern is just having feelings of concern towards other people. So these are questions like, how warm do you feel towards people? How soft-hearted do you feel towards people? How concerned are you for other people's well-being? Perspective taking is your ability to sort of put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? See the world from their perspective. And people who score high in perspective taking and empathetic concern are more likely to help, especially this sort of relatively selfless helping without expectation of some kind of reward or some kind of benefit for themselves. You can think of this again in terms of the ABCs of psychology, affect, behavior, cognition. You can think of perspective taking as cognitive empathy and empathetic concern as affective empathy. So, there are these personality differences, things like empathetic concern, cognitive resources, right? So people who are less cognitively busy, more likely to help. But there are also different situations, right? If we feel like someone is responsible for their situation, we're going to be less likely to help them. So for example, if you watch that video, the English video of the person laying in the street, if you watch the entire video, what you'll see is at the end, they vary the dress that the person is in. So the man is sort of laying hunched over on the stairs, moaning for help, and he's dressed sort of rather shabbily, in sort of relatively, dirty, disheveled looking clothes, and no one helps him. He lays there for 30 minutes and people literally step over him. But they take that same man and they put him in a suit and tie and people help him within minutes, right? Part of this is attributions of responsibility. If you see a homeless person on the street, you make the assumption that, you think back in terms of the fundamental attribution error. Well, they must be homeless because of something about them, right? It's their responsibility. It's their fault. Therefore, they don't deserve help. Whereas, when you see the man in the suit laying down on the sidewalks, moaning, people think that this is an emergency. There must be something going on here. And again, they're not making that person responsible for their own situation. Right. And this does influence whether or not we help. So the last thing we can sort of talk about, we could ask, are there gender differences in helping? Typically depends on the situation. In immediate emergencies, men tend to help more. But this is, back to this idea of competence and ability, right? So you might notice an emergency and you might see it as a situation where you need to help, but you don't feel like you're able to help, physically able. Carnegie heroes tend to be men, and these are people who are, men are going to be the ones who are going to feel able to jump down onto the train tracks and lift a 200-pound man back onto the platform. But women are more likely to offer non-emergency help. So, this is social support. This is caregiving. This is offering to watch someone's kids or, cook someone a meal or, run errands for someone who's in some kind of emergency situation. It's not that women offer less dangerous, right, help. It's just it has to do with physical abilities. So women in World War II were more likely to harbor Jewish refugees, which is arguably at that time a very dangerous thing to do. But it doesn't require physical strength in order to accomplish. All right, so that's it for helping. So email me if you have any questions.